The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers and the warmth from her bones, but it could not steal the life kicking inside her. Elena sat on the frozen pavement, her back pressed against the unforgiving brick of a building that would never welcome her. Her belly, swollen with 8 months of a life she both cherished and feared for, was a heavy, constant reminder of her failure. People passed by, their faces a blur of indifference and mild disgust. They saw a problem, a stain on their perfect afternoon. They didn't see a woman who once had dreams, a woman whose heart had been shattered by the slam of a door and the cold finality of the words, "It's not my problem." She was invisible, a ghost in a city of ghosts, fighting for two. Hunger was a different kind of pain, a gnawing, hollow ache that twisted her insides. It was a constant companion, whispering cruelties about her inability to provide. She watched a child drop a half-eaten pretzel, and the shame that burned in her chest was hotter than any fever as she considered picking it up. The judgment in the eyes of the child's mother was a physical blow, a silent condemnation that screamed, unfit, unworthy, less than human. Elena wasn't begging for herself. She was begging for the tiny, innocent soul who depended on her for everything. She would swallow her pride, piece by piece, if it meant her child would know the feeling of a full stomach. Dignity was a luxury, a warm coat she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency she had left. She remembered the warmth of a bed, the safety of 4 walls. The memories were ghosts that haunted her in the lonely hours before dawn. She remembered his hand on her belly, the promises of a future that dissolved like sugar in the rain the moment she confirmed the pregnancy. The betrayal wasn't just in his leaving. It was in the casual cruelty of it, the ease with which he had erased her and their child from his life. That coldness was far more brutal than any winter night. The world saw a homeless, pregnant woman, but inside she was still standing in that empty apartment, the echo of a closing door the only sound, realizing she was utterly and completely alone. The world had moved on, but she was trapped in the wreckage. Every shiver that racked her body sent a jolt of terror through her. It wasn't for herself. She had endured pain, had learned to live with the constant ache of emptiness. Her fear was for the fragile life within her, a life that deserved more than a concrete bed and a lullaby of wailing sirens. Where would she go when the time came? Who would help her bring her child into a world that had already turned its back on them? This terror was a suffocating blanket, heavier than her swollen body, colder than the wind that whipped through the alleyways. She would press her hands against her stomach, a silent promise to the baby inside. I will not let you suffer. I will find a way. I have to. It was a vow, made of desperation and ferocious primal love. Then the sky broke. The rain began not as a drizzle, but as a deluge, a cold, relentless assault that soaked through her thin jacket in seconds. It was as if the city itself was trying to wash her away, to erase her from its sidewalks. She stumbled to her feet, searching for any sliver of shelter, but every awning seemed to shrink. Every doorway was already claimed. The water ran in rivulets down her face, mixing with tears she didn't even realize she was crying. This was it, the absolute bottom, a cold, wet despair that threatened to extinguish the last ember of her will. But as the freezing water seeped into her very soul, it did not put out the fire of a mother's instinct. It fanned it into a desperate, reckless flame. The rain was no longer just water, it was an enemy. Each drop was a shard of ice, a tiny hammer striking her skin, determined to break what little spirit she had left. Ahead, through the downpour, a stone wall rose from the darkness. It was low in one section, an almost imperceptible flaw in an otherwise perfect fortress of wealth. For a normal person, it was a boundary. For Elena, it was an invitation born of sheer desperation. Climbing it was a clumsy, painful struggle. Her swollen body protested, her muscles screamed, but the thought of the life inside her was a powerful fuel. She wasn't breaking a law. She was fighting for a chance to survive the night. This wasn't a crime of greed, but an act of preservation. Once over the wall, she found herself in a world she had only seen in magazines. Perfectly manicured lawns, sculpted trees, a silence so profound it felt louder than the city's chaos. Then she saw it, a glass aviary, glowing with a soft, warm light like a captured star. It was a beacon in her personal storm. She stumbled toward it, her wet clothes clinging to her like a second skin, leaving muddy tracks on the pristine stone path. She didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like a refugee seeking asylum. The glass walls reflected a distorted image of her, a broken, swollen figure against a backdrop of impossible beauty. The door was unlocked, a small miracle in a life devoid of them. She slipped inside, the sudden warmth a painful, welcome shock. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic flowers, a stark contrast to the stench of wet pavement and despair. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the warmth seep into her bones, a luxury she hadn't felt in months. But her respite was cut short by a sound, a faint, desperate peep that pierced the tranquil air. Her eyes, trained to notice the smallest details, scanned the floor. There, half submerged in a puddle of muddy water near a planter, was a tiny bird chick. It was shivering violently, its feathers matted, its life fading with every pathetic tremor. In that fragile creature, Eleanor saw a reflection of her own unborn child, helpless, innocent, and at the mercy of a cruel world. Her own exhaustion vanished, replaced by a fierce, maternal urgency. Ignoring the ache in her back and the strain on her belly, Eleanor lowered herself to the ground. The movement was slow, agonizing, but her focus was absolute. She gently scooped the chick into her hands, her fingers, though cold and numb, forming a protective cradle. She could feel the faint, fluttering heartbeat against her palm, a fragile pulse of life fighting against the cold. Looking up, she spotted the nest high above in the branches of a lush, indoor tree. Her only thought was to return the baby to its home. The ornate cage door was the only way to get closer to the tree's base. She unlatched it, not to take, but to give back. Her actions were driven by a purity of heart that the world had long stopped showing her. Suddenly, the serene darkness was shattered by the blinding glare of flashlights. Two security guards burst in, their faces grim masks of suspicion. They saw the scene through a lens of prejudice. A filthy, pregnant vagrant, her hands caked in mud, standing before an open cage worth a fortune. They didn't see a rescue, they saw a crime in progress. "Don't move! Put it down!" one of them yelled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and heavy. They had already written her story, casting her as the villain without reading a single word of her truth. In their eyes, she was not a person in need, but a threat to be neutralized. Her poverty was her guilt. Eleanor tried to speak, to make them understand. "No, you don't see. It's hurt," she pleaded, her voice a fragile whisper against their storm of authority. She held out her cupped hands, offering the tiny, shivering chick as proof of her innocence. But they didn't look. They saw only her disheveled appearance, her swollen belly, her trespassing presence. To them, she was a liar, a manipulator using her condition as a shield for her crime. "Save the story," the other guard sneered, stepping closer. "We've heard it all before." Her desperation was dismissed as an act, her compassion twisted into a con. She was trapped in their narrative, a prisoner of their judgment, long before they ever laid a hand on her. Their hands grabbed her arms, the grip clinical and bruising. She flinched, not from the pain, but from the complete lack of humanity in their touch. They were handling an object, a problem to be removed. One guard spoke into his shoulder radio, his voice dripping with detached contempt. "We have a trespasser in the aviary. Female, pregnant. Looks like she was trying to steal one of the birds." The words echoed, each one a stone thrown at her dignity. She was being erased, replaced by a convenient caricature of the poor and desperate. The real Elena, the mother-to-be, the woman who chose kindness in the face of cruelty, was invisible to them. They were just doing their job, but their job was to protect property, not to see a soul. The situation was escalating into a nightmare. She couldn't escape. Eleanor held the chick closer to her chest, a primal instinct to protect the one thing more helpless than herself. The guards interpreted the gesture as defiance, as her clinging to the evidence of her supposed crime. They saw a thief, not a guardian. The chasm between her reality and their perception was impossibly wide, a canyon of prejudice that no truth could cross. They were the enforcers of a world that had cast her out, and now they were here to formalize her exile. The stage was set for a confrontation, not just with the law, but with the cold, unyielding heart of a man who had forgotten how to feel. If this story is touching your heart, please like and share. There are so many people who live through this kind of judgment in silence. The sound of the security alert was a sacrilege in the tomb-like silence of the mansion. Damien Blackwood did not flinch. For 5 years, nothing had truly moved him. He sat in his leather chair, the glow of a monitor casting long shadows across a face etched with a grief so profound it had become a permanent part of his architecture. The alert was an annoyance, a disruption to the meticulously ordered emptiness of his life. It came from the aviary, his wife's sanctuary, the one place on this sprawling estate that was more memory than structure. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Someone had dared to cross the line, to tread on hallowed ground. He rose, not with anger, but with a cold or weary sense of duty. He would extinguish this small fire and return to his ghosts. He walked through the sterile corridors of his home, each step echoing the hollowness within him. He didn't need the guards to escort him. This was his domain, his pain, and he would face this intrusion alone. The rain lashed against the windows, a furious, chaotic sound that mirrored the disorder he was about to confront. He despised chaos. It was chaos that had stolen his wife and daughter, a random, meaningless act that had shattered his universe. Now some petty thief or vagrant had brought that chaos into the one place he kept pristine. He already knew what he would find: a nobody, a leech looking for something to pawn. He had no room for compassion. His heart was a barren landscape, and he intended to keep it that way. When he entered the aviary, the scene was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just a trespass, it was a desecration. There, standing in a puddle of mud and filth, was a woman. She was large, swollen with child, her clothes soaked and clinging to her form. She looked like a creature born of the storm, a manifestation of the world's ugliness, staining the polished floors of his wife's beautiful dream. Her hands were caked in dirt, and the door to one of the most valuable cages, the one that housed his wife's favorite species, was ajar. In that single damning image, his mind convicted her. He saw not a person in need, but a parasite, an opportunistic thief using her pregnancy as a pathetic shield for her greed. His voice, when it came, was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "Call the police," he said to the head of security, his eyes locked on Eleanor, stripping her of any humanity. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute, a palpable force in the humid air. He ignored the tiny, shivering thing in her hands, dismissing it as part of her ploy. Elena's mouth opened, a desperate plea forming on her lips, but he cut her off with a single, dismissive gesture. "I don't want to hear it. You are trespassing. You attempted to steal property. That is all I need to know." He spoke of her as if she were a line item on a damage report, a problem to be efficiently and ruthlessly solved. The guards moved to flank her, their presence a physical reinforcement of his power. They were extensions of his will, tools to restore the sterile order she had violated. Eleanor looked from their grim faces back to Damien, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of arrest. It was the terror of not being seen, of having her truth suffocated before it could even be spoken. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand." But he did understand, or so he believed. He understood the language of desperation, the lies people told to escape consequences. He had built an empire on seeing through deception, and he saw it now, in the dirt on her face and the calculated panic in her eyes. To him, she was a symbol of everything he had come to hate about the world: its messiness, its weakness, its relentless attempts to take from him. He had fortified himself against it, building walls of wealth and solitude, but somehow this creature had slipped through. She was using her condition, her obvious poverty, as a weapon to prey on the guilt of others. He would feel no guilt. He had paid his dues to tragedy, and his account was overdrawn. He saw her swollen belly not as a sign of impending motherhood, but as the ultimate tool of manipulation. He would make an example of her. He would show the world that the walls around Damien Blackwood were impenetrable, especially to appeals for mercy. He turned his back on her, a final brutal act of dismissal. It was a gesture more powerful than any word, communicating her utter insignificance. He was already walking away, retreating back into the sterile safety of his mansion, leaving the guards to handle the cleanup. He could hear her begin to sob behind him, a broken, wretched sound that he forced himself to ignore. It was just noise, the soundtrack of another person's bad decisions. He had his own grief to attend to, a silent, orderly grief that this woman had so rudely interrupted. Let the law deal with her. Let the system that failed to protect his family now serve to protect his property from the likes of her. The cold finality of his departure hung in the air, heavier than the tropical humidity of the aviary. Eleanor was trapped. The path to understanding was blocked by a wall of pain so high and so thick that her small, desperate truth could never hope to climb it. The police were coming. Her child would be born in a cell, and it would be her fault. She had tried to do something good, an act of pure, selfless compassion, and it had led her to this, judged and condemned by a man who saw a monster where there was only a mother. The clash of their worlds was not a collision. It was an annihilation. His world had simply erased hers. The arrival of the police was an assault of light and sound. Flashing blue and red beams sliced through the aviary's glass walls, painting the exotic foliage in garish, urgent colors that desecrated the serene space. Two officers entered, their expressions a familiar blend of boredom and authority. They saw the scene just as the guards had, a rich man's property, a poor woman's crime. Their movements were efficient, their questions perfunctory. "What's the situation?" one asked the head guard, his gaze sweeping over Elena with professional disinterest. She was a file to be opened, a report to be written, a problem to be processed. The system had arrived, and it wore a uniform and carried the weight of preconceived notions. For Elena, the arrival of the law was not the promise of justice, but the certainty of condemnation. Elena's resistance was not a shout, but a whisper of defiance. She ignored the officers, her entire being focused on the tiny, fragile life cupped in her hands. She could feel its tremors weakening, its life force fading like a dying ember. She gently blew a warm breath over it, a futile but deeply human gesture of comfort. The officers saw stubbornness. Damien, watching from the periphery, saw an unsettling, almost maddening single-mindedness. A thief would be begging, making excuses, trying to bargain. This woman was acting like a mother shielding her child from a storm, oblivious to the fact that the storm was about to consume her. Her silence was louder than any plea, a quiet testament to a truth they were all refusing to see. It was a resistance of the soul. Damien stood apart, a statue carved from ice and memory. He had expected this to be simple, a clean, swift removal of an unwanted element. Yet it wasn't. The woman's strange, quiet resolve was a grain of sand in the perfectly calibrated machine of his indifference. He had built his world to be devoid of such messy, unpredictable emotions. He watched her protect the bird, a creature worth thousands. Yes, but to her it was clearly priceless in a way money could not measure. This didn't compute. It didn't align with the simple narrative of a desperate vagrant stealing for a quick score. For the first time in 5 years, an external event had breached his internal fortress, not with force, but with a question he couldn't immediately answer. "All right, ma'am, let's go," the older officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He reached for her arm. The raw, instinctual way Elena flinched away, shielding the chick with her body, was not the reaction of a criminal caught in the act. It was the desperate movement of a protector. "Please," she finally said, her voice raspy with unshed tears. "It's freezing, it will die." The officer sighed, a sound of practiced impatience. "It's a bird. You're going to jail for trespassing and attempted theft. The bird is the least of your worries right now." His words were meant to be a dose of reality, but they only highlighted the vast, unbridgeable gap between his world of procedure and her world of primal compassion. He saw a nuisance. She saw a heartbeat. The younger officer, trying to be clever, chimed in with a sneer. "Using the baby bump for sympathy, huh? Classic move. Think the judge will go easy on you? 'Cause you're knocked up." The words were a public stripping of her dignity, a verbal acid thrown on her most vulnerable state. The comment hung in the humid air, vile and sticky. It was designed to break her, to reduce her motherhood to a cheap tactic. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes, for the first time, blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with desperation and everything to do with righteous fury. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look she gave him was a silent, powerful indictment of his cruelty, a defense of her honor that shamed his uniform. A flicker of something crossed Damien's face. It was disgust, But for once, it wasn't directed at the woman caked in mud. It was for the officer's casual brutality, the cheap shot at a person already on the ground. It reminded him of the vultures in the media after his family's accident, their insatiable need to pick apart a tragedy for a story. He had forgotten what common cruelty looked like, sealed away in his sterile mansion. This raw, ugly display of it was jarring. He remained silent, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but inside, a hairline crack appeared in his certainty. He had judged her just as harshly, if more quietly. The officer's ugliness was a distorted mirror of his own cold assumptions. The head of security, eager to resolve the situation for his employer, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, we can have her processed and removed immediately. No need for you to be troubled by this any longer." His words were meant to be reassuring, a promise to restore the sterile order. But they sounded hollow now, framing Eleanor not as a person, but as a piece of trash to be disposed of. The phrase "troubled by this" echoed in the space. Damien was troubled, but not in the way his employee assumed. He was troubled by the woman's unwavering dignity in the face of abject humiliation, by her fierce protection of something so small. He was troubled because his simple, clean-cut judgment of her was beginning to feel profoundly and disturbingly wrong. Trapped and surrounded, Elena's body began to tremble, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of the injustice. Yet she did not beg for herself. Her focus remained laser-sharp on the mission that had brought her to this point. She looked past the officers, past the guards, and her eyes found Damien's. It was not a look of supplication, but one of shared responsibility. It was as if she was saying, "This life is in our hands, yours and mine. What are you going to do?" In that moment, she wasn't a vagrant and he wasn't a millionaire. They were just two people connected by the fate of a dying creature. Her strength wasn't in fighting back, but in her refusal to let them distract her from what truly mattered. The tension in the aviary was thick enough to suffocate. The rain hammered against the glass, a relentless percussion to the silent standoff. The officers were growing impatient, their hands inching toward their handcuffs. The security guards stood like sentinels, waiting for the final command from their master. Damien felt the weight of every eye upon him. He was the king in this glass castle, and his word was law. All he had to do was nod, and she would disappear into the uncaring gears of the justice system. It was the logical, rational, and easy thing to do. It was the decision the old Damien, the one from 10 minutes ago, would have made without a second thought. But something held him back, a profound, unwelcome hesitation. He took a step forward, his expensive shoes silent on the stone floor. His intention was to end it, to give the order and retreat back into his silent world. "Take her," he started to say, the words forming in the cold chamber of his throat. But as he spoke, Elena made a small, desperate sound, a half-sob, half-gasp. Her hands, which had been cradling the chick, opened slightly. He saw it then, truly saw it for the first time, not as an object, not as evidence, but as a living thing, a tiny, featherless creature, its beak opening and closing in a silent, desperate plea for life. It was so fragile, so impossibly small against the backdrop of so much power and prejudice, and its fight for life was the only thing that mattered. In that frozen moment, as the officer's hand reached for her, Elena did the one thing no one expected. She did not fight. She did not plead for her freedom. With a guttural sound of pain that was part effort and part despair, she began to lower her massive, pregnant body to the cold, muddy floor. The movement was agonizingly slow, a testament to the strain on her exhausted frame. Every person in the aviary, the guards, the officers, even Damien, stopped, mesmerized by this strange act of surrender. It was not the posture of a cornered thief, but of a worshipper at a grim altar. Her entire world had shrunk to the precious, fragile thing she held in her hands, and she knelt before it. Her eyes, glistening with tears that had not yet fallen, lifted from the chick and found Damien's. She looked past the uniforms, past the threat of prison, and straight into the soul of the one man who held all the power. It was a gaze stripped of all pretense, a raw, primal communication between two beings who understood the fragility of life. There was no anger in her eyes, no defiance, only a shared, terrible knowledge. The tears finally spilled over, carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears for her own fate, but for the tiny, innocent life she was failing to save. The silent plea in her eyes was more powerful than any spoken word. An arrow aimed directly at the heart he thought was long dead. Then her voice, a broken whisper that seemed to claw its way out of her throat, filled the silence. "It's dying," she choked out, her gaze never leaving his. "Please, help me, it's dying." The words were not an excuse or a justification. They were a pure, unadulterated cry for help on behalf of another. She was a mother, pleading for a child. This complete and utter selflessness was a foreign language in Damien's world of transactions and self-interest. It was a variable his cold logic could not compute. The officers exchanged a confused glance, their professional certainty momentarily shaken. This wasn't in their training manual. The scene had veered off script, driven by an emotion too real to be an act. Damien's first reaction was a wave of profound annoyance. How dare she try this pathetic, theatrical maneuver on him? He was immune to such cheap emotional blackmail. He let his gaze drop to her hands, his mind already preparing the cold, cutting dismissal. He expected to see a bauble, some trinket she had managed to snatch, the worthless prize for which she was now willing to sacrifice her freedom. He steeled himself against the performance, ready to deliver the final verdict and banish her from his sight, to restore the pristine, silent order of his life. He saw her as a predictable cliché of desperation, and he was tired of the show before it had even truly begun. His judgment was swift, absolute, and utterly wrong. He did not see a stolen object. He saw life, fading. Nestled in her muddy palms was a sun parakeet chick, its vibrant potential still sheathed in damp, sparse down. He recognized the species instantly. It was his wife's favorite, the one she called her pocketful of sunshine. A memory, sharp and violent, ambushed him. He was standing in this exact spot 5 years ago, sun streaming through the glass, and his wife, laughing, had cupped her hands in the very same way to show him their first hatchling. "Look, Damien Dark," she had whispered, her eyes alight with a joy he had forgotten could exist. A tiny miracle. The past crashed into the present, and the impact left him breathless. He tore his eyes from the bird and looked, truly looked, at Elena's face. He saw past the dirt and the exhaustion, and what he found there shattered him. It was not the cunning of a thief. It was the pure, maternal terror of a mother watching her child slip away. It was a mirror. He saw a reflection of his own face in the sterile and fluorescent light of a hospital emergency room. He saw the same desperate pleading, the same frantic helplessness as he begged doctors, God, anyone, to save his daughter. He was seeing his own personal hell played out in the eyes of a complete stranger, a woman he had condemned without a thought. The shared agony was a bridge between their two worlds, built in an instant. The fortress he had built around his heart, constructed brick by brick from grief and cynicism, did not just crack, it was obliterated. The cold, calculated indifference that had been his only armor for 5 years dissolved into a hot, searing flood of shame and empathy. In that moment, she was not a vagrant, she was not a criminal. She was the embodiment of the fierce, protective love that he himself had lost by trying to save this one insignificant life. She was honoring the memory of his wife and daughter more profoundly than his sterile, empty mausoleum ever could. He had been guarding a memory while she was fighting for a life. He had been so profoundly, devastatingly wrong. The world rushed back in, but the acoustics had changed. The hammering rain was no longer an intrusion, it was a frantic heartbeat. The flashing police lights were not a sign of justice, but a garish, inappropriate violation of a sacred moment. The only thing that mattered in the entire universe was the flicker of life in Elena's hands. The authority in his posture collapsed, replaced by a raw, human urgency he hadn't felt since the accident. The protector in him, the husband and father he thought had died on that roadside, was resurrected by a stranger's compassion. His next words were not for the police, but for the life they were all about to lose. His voice, when it finally broke free, was a sound no one on his staff had ever heard. It was not the icy command of Damien Blackwood, the magnate. It was a raw, guttural cry, torn from the deepest part of his soul. "Help!" The word was a shockwave, echoing off the glass, making the officers flinch. He spun around, his eyes wild and blazing with a terrifying fire. "Call the vet! Now!" he roared at his security chief. Tell him it's an emergency. Get blankets from the house, a heat lamp, anything. Go." His commands were no longer about control or punishment. They were the desperate orders of a field general in a battle against death itself. He didn't wait for them to act. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside Elena, his $1,000 suit forgotten, his composure a distant memory. The two of them, the millionaire and the vagrant, were now equals, partners in a desperate alliance to shield a tiny flame from the storm. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not to take, but to share the burden. "It's okay," he whispered. The words meant as much for himself as for her. "We're going to help him." The police stood frozen, their authority rendered meaningless, silent witnesses to the moment a man's heart, against all odds, started to beat again. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear your story. The chaos subsided into a focused, reverent silence. The police officers, now awkward and irrelevant, were dismissed with a single sharp wave of Damien's hand. They vanished like ghosts, their flashing lights a retreating, garish memory. Inside the aviary, the vet worked under a portable lamp, a small, tense circle of light in the vast, humid darkness. Elena, wrapped in a thick wool blanket someone had brought from the house, sat on a bench, a silent observer. She watched Damien pace, his movements stripped of their earlier arrogance, now charged with a raw, desperate energy. He wasn't looking at her, he couldn't. His shame was a physical presence, a wall he had erected between them, but this time he was the one trapped behind it. He had judged a soul and found his own wanting. After what felt like an eternity, Damien finally stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes, which had been voids of cold judgment, were now filled with a broken, unfamiliar light. He didn't offer a grand apology. The words would have been cheap, insulting. Instead, he spoke in a low, strained voice, the sound of a man admitting a profound defeat. "There is a guest house on the property. It's warm, it's empty. You will stay there." It wasn't a request, nor was it a command. It was a statement of fact, a clumsy attempt to right a catastrophic wrong. Elena met his gaze, her pride a quiet, unyielding flame. She did not thank him. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, an acceptance not of charity but of a truce. It was for her child. Dignity was not in refusing help, but in knowing why you accept it. He led her out of the aviary, away from the scene of her humiliation and his undoing. The rain had softened to a gentle whisper, washing the world clean. The path to the guest house was lit by soft, low lamps, each one a small beacon guiding her from the darkness. One of the guards, the same man who had sneered at her, now walked ahead, his shoulders hunched, carrying a tray with a steaming mug and a plate of food. The transformation was absolute. She was no longer a trespasser to be expelled, but a charge to be protected. Damien walked beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, the silence between them thick with unspoken truths. He had offered her shelter, but she had offered him something far more valuable, a crack of light in his 5-year-long night. The guest house was not opulent, but it was a sanctuary. It smelled of clean linen and wood smoke from a recently lit fireplace. For the first time in months, Elena felt a warmth that reached her bones, a safety that allowed her muscles to finally unclench. She ran a hand over the soft quilt on the bed, her fingers tracing the patterns as if relearning the language of comfort. This was more than a roof over her head. It was an acknowledgement. It was the world telling her she was worthy of a safe place to bring her child into it. Damien placed a single, old-fashioned brass key on the small wooden table by the door. "It's yours," he said quietly, before turning and leaving her in the peaceful solitude she had so desperately earned. An hour later, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Damien. He didn't enter, but stood on the threshold, his frame silhouetted against the rainy night. "The vet says he will make it," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "The chick, he's a fighter." Eleanor, sitting by the fire, placed a hand over her own swollen belly, feeling the strong, steady kick of the life within her. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in an age. In saving one small, fragile life, she had inadvertently saved 2 broken people. The house was a reward, yes, but the true prize was this quiet moment of shared victory, a fragile promise that even after the most brutal of storms, new life and new hope could find a way to begin. Weeks melted into a quiet rhythm, transforming the guest house from a shelter into a home. Elena's body, once a landscape of exhaustion and fear, began to heal. The hollow ache of hunger was replaced by the simple, profound pleasure of a warm meal. The sharp edges of her anxiety softened by the safety of 4 walls and a locked door. She spent her days nesting, folding tiny clothes donated by one of the housekeepers, her hands moving with a serene purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer a problem to be ignored, a ghost on a city sidewalk. Here, in this quiet pocket of the world, she was simply Eleanor, a mother waiting to meet her son. She had not been given charity. She had been given back her humanity. For Damien, the mansion's suffocating silence had changed. It was no longer the sound of absence, but of anticipation. He found himself drawn to the aviary, not to mourn his wife, but to visit the small, resilient life Elena had saved. The chick, which he had quietly named Soul, was thriving, a tiny, vibrant jewel of sunshine and noise. His staff watched the transformation in stunned silence. The icy mask of their employer was melting, revealing the man they had not seen in 5 years. He spoke to them, asked about their families, his voice no longer a tool of command but of connection. He realized his wealth had built him a magnificent tomb. Eleanor, with nothing but her fierce, compassionate heart, had shown him how to find the door out. He began to visit the guest house, his appearances brief and hesitant at first. He would bring books or a small bouquet of flowers from his wife's garden, placing them on the porch without a word. One evening he found the courage to knock. They sat in comfortable silence by the fire before he finally spoke. "Have you chosen a name?" he asked, his voice soft. Eleanor placed a hand on her belly. "Leo," she said, "for strength." Damien nodded, a flicker of a forgotten emotion in his eyes. He saw the truth then. She had always been the strong one. They were 2 survivors of different storms, 2 lonely souls learning to speak the quiet, universal language of a shared harbor, their strange bond forged in mud and mercy. The night her labor began, the storm returned, lashing against the windows as if to reclaim her. But this time, she was not alone. Damien waited in the main house, pacing the cold marble floors, a ghost haunted not by the past, but by a desperate hope for the future. He was not a father, not a husband, not a landlord. He was a sentinel, standing guard over a new beginning. When the housekeeper finally brought the news, the sound of a baby's first piercing cry reached him from across the lawn. It was a sound that did not erase the silence his own daughter had left behind, but wove itself into it, creating a new, fragile music, the bittersweet melody of life going on, impossibly, beautifully. A few days later, he entered the guest house to find Eleanor by the window, rocking her son in her arms. The infant was a perfect, tiny miracle, his face peaceful in the soft morning light. Damien stood there for a long moment, simply watching them, the fierce protector and the life she had fought so hard to protect. He approached slowly and looked down at the baby. He saw not a reminder of what he had lost, but a symbol of what he had found. A genuine, unforced smile touched his lips, a crack of light on a face long cast in shadow. He saw not the desperate woman from the storm, but the quiet architect of his own rescue, the woman who had saved more than one small life that night. Her journey had started on a cold pavement, a place where dignity was a luxury she could not afford. Now she held the future in her arms, her worth never defined by her poverty, but by the boundless strength of her heart. Damien, who had everything, had learned from the woman who had nothing that a heart is the only shelter that truly matters. He had lost a family to tragedy, and in the most unlikely of ways, he had found another in compassion. She had come seeking refuge from the rain, and in the end, she had taught a broken man how to live in the sun again. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and send this video to someone who needs to believe in hope.